Welcome back to Unheard Stories, the channel where we dive into the deepest, most twisted tales of betrayal, revenge, and redemption. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're all watching from. I love seeing our community grow from all around the world. And while you're at it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss the wild ride ahead. This channel is packed with the craziest cheating stories, each one more shocking than the last. Now let me ask you something. What would you do if 12 years of love, trust, and commitment shattered in just one night? Imagine being blindsided by the person you thought would stand by you forever. That's exactly what happened to Ethan, a man who thought he had it all: a loving wife, a stable career, and a seemingly perfect life. Little did he know, his world was about to implode. Ethan had always been the steady, reliable type. A dedicated man who poured his heart into his career as a financial consultant and into his marriage to Alina, his wife of 12 years. Alina was everything he thought he wanted: intelligent, stunning, and confident. Together they built a life that their friends often envied: a beautiful home, lavish vacations, and a partnership that seemed unbreakable. But beneath that facade of perfection, something was rotting. Subtle cracks began to form: the late-night work meetings, the whispered phone calls, and the unexplained absences. Ethan, ever the optimist, pushed away the nagging doubts, chalking them up to the pressures of Alina's demanding career in marketing. Until one fateful evening when a single note, one that wasn't even meant for him, fell into his hands. That small piece of paper was the spark that ignited a blaze of heartbreak, fury, and ultimately revenge. Tonight we're diving deep into Ethan's journey, a tale filled with betrayal, secrets, and a path to redemption so gripping that you'll be hooked until the very end. What happens when trust is broken beyond repair? How far would you go to take back control of your life? Buckle up, everyone, because this story isn't just about heartbreak. It's about transformation. Get ready for an emotional roller coaster filled with shocking twists, fiery confrontations, and a final act of revenge so satisfying that you'll be cheering by the end. Let's keep this conversation going. Ethan sat in his car, staring at the crumpled piece of paper in his trembling hand. The words written in sharp, hurried strokes burned into his mind: Room 214. 8 p.m. Don't be late. His chest tightened as he reread the note for the 100th time, the implication crystal clear. It wasn't addressed to him, nor was the handwriting his. It was Alina's, the wife he had loved unconditionally for over a decade. The note had been tucked into a small stack of papers in her purse, a discovery made purely by chance. He wasn't the snooping type, but something about her recent behavior had gnawed at him. The late-night phone calls she claimed weren't work emergencies, the distant look in her eyes, the sudden uptick in her weekend outings, it all added up to a storm brewing beneath the surface of their lives. And now here he was, parked in front of a swanky downtown hotel, questioning every choice that had led him to this moment. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd walk in to find her working on a surprise for him or meeting an old friend. But deep down, a cold knot of dread had already formed in his stomach. As the minutes ticked closer to 8 p.m., Ethan felt his resolve harden. Whatever he was about to discover, he needed to face it head-on. Gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination, he stepped out of the car and made his way toward the entrance. The lobby was buzzing with activity, couples chatting in hushed tones, a group laughing near the bar, the faint chime of an elevator in the distance. But for Ethan it was all a blur. Every step felt heavier than the last as he approached the elevator. He punched the button for the second floor, his heart pounding like a drumbeat in his chest. The ride up was agonizingly slow. Ethan's mind conjured the worst possible scenarios, each one more gut-wrenching than the last. His palms were clammy, his breathing shallow, and his vision tunneled as the elevator dinged, signaling his arrival on the second floor. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, a sea of identical doors with polished brass numbers. Room 214 was halfway down, its door closed, a faint glow of light seeping from underneath. He paused in front of it, his breath catching in his throat. A part of him wanted to turn back, to cling to the illusion of normalcy. But it was too late for that. Whatever lay beyond this door would change everything. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled desperation, Ethan slammed his foot into the door. The lock splintered with a sharp crack, and the door banged against the wall as it flew open. The scene that greeted him was something out of a nightmare. The room reeked of sweat and alcohol. Alina lay sprawled across the king-sized bed, her golden hair fanned out on the pillows. She was wearing nothing but a careless smirk that froze mid-laugh as she saw him. Around her were four men, shirtless and disheveled, their expressions morphing from smug amusement to stunned panic in an instant. Ethan's world narrowed to a single point of focus: Alina. The woman he had trusted implicitly, the center of his life, now lay before him as a stranger. "What the hell is this?" he roared, his voice raw with fury and heartbreak. Alina didn't answer. One of the men, a tall, wiry guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a bad action movie, stepped forward, raising his hands defensively. "Hey man, let's talk about this." But Ethan wasn't in the mood to talk. The weeks of suspicion, the sleepless nights, the whispered lies, they all erupted in a primal wave of rage. He lunged forward, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a sickening thud. The room erupted into chaos as the other men scrambled to defend themselves. Ethan was a man possessed. Years of frustration and heartbreak fueled his every move as he swung, punched, and fought back against the crowd of strangers in his wife's bed. One man managed to grab him from behind, but Ethan slammed his elbow into the man's ribs, sending him sprawling onto the floor. Another tried to throw a punch, but Ethan ducked, countering with a blow that left the man clutching his stomach and gasping for air. In the middle of the chaos, Ethan caught a glimpse of Alina, frozen in place, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and something that looked like guilt, or maybe it was annoyance. "You're ruining everything," she finally shouted, her voice cutting through the melee like a knife. Ethan turned to her, his chest heaving, his fists bloodied. "Ruining everything?" he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You've already done that, Alina." The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. One of the men groaned from the floor, clutching his arm in pain, while another leaned against the dresser, his nose bleeding profusely. Alina sat up, pulling a sheet around her, her expression unreadable. The door burst open and uniformed officers flooded the room. "Hands where we can see them," one of them barked. Ethan slowly raised his arms, the adrenaline draining from his body as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. As the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, Ethan glanced at Alina one last time. She stared back at him, her face unreadable. But in her eyes he saw no regret, no remorse, just cold, calculating indifference. And as the officers led him away, only one thought looped through Ethan's mind: this isn't over. The fluorescent lights in the police station hummed softly, their cold, sterile glow only intensifying the pounding in Ethan's skull. He sat slumped in the hard metal chair of an interrogation room, his wrists raw from the handcuffs and his knuckles split and crusted with blood. The events of the night swirled in his mind like a storm, disjointed and chaotic. Alina on the bed, the men, the fight, the sirens. The door creaked open and a wiry man in a crisp suit strode in. Detective Harper. His sharp features and calculating eyes immediately gave away his no-nonsense demeanor. He dropped a manila folder onto the scuffed table and pulled out the chair opposite Ethan, sitting down with a casual confidence that made Ethan feel exposed. "Well, Mr. Hunter," Harper began, his voice calm but edged with authority, "you certainly made a mess tonight. 5 men hospitalized, one with a broken nose, another with cracked ribs. You're lucky nobody's dead." Ethan remained silent, his jaw clenched tightly. The named Hunter felt foreign, detached from who he was now. This wasn't the Ethan Hunter who spent Sunday mornings fixing things around the house or surprised his wife with flowers just because. This was someone else, a man betrayed, broken, and burning with fury. Detective Harper leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Start talking. Why'd you go full action hero in a hotel room tonight? What were you thinking?" Ethan exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the question. "I walked in on my wife cheating," he said, his voice hoarse. "With multiple men. What would you have done?" Harper tilted his head, considering Ethan's words. "Most people," he replied, "would have walked away. Called a lawyer. You, on the other hand, turned it into a bar fight." Ethan's fist clenched instinctively, the memory of Alina's mocking expression igniting a fresh wave of anger. "She's my wife," he said, his voice rising. 12 years of marriage and I walk in on that. You don't get to tell me how I should have reacted." Harper studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he leaned back in his chair, pulling out a notepad and clicking his pen. "Your wife's in the hospital," he said. "Paramedics found traces of alcohol and possibly drugs in her system. She's stable but—" He didn't finish the sentence but the implication hung in the air. "Drugs. Alina." It didn't fit. She was the type to spend an hour debating organic versus non-organic produce. The thought of her involving herself in something so reckless was unfathomable. Or at least it had been. Ethan's mind reeled. Who was this woman he thought he knew? The one who used to laugh at his jokes, who planned their vacations down to the last detail. Was it all a lie? The memories of their life together now felt hollow, like photographs of strangers masquerading as a family. "Tell me, Mr. Hunter," Harper interrupted his spiraling thoughts, "how long has this been going on?" Ethan blinked, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe weeks? Months? I didn't see it coming." "Didn't see it coming?" Harper echoed, his tone skeptical. "No signs? No red flags? A woman doesn't just wake up one day and decide to blow up her marriage like this." Ethan's mind flashed back to the whispers, the late-night phone calls, the excuses about work. "There were signs," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I ignored them. I wanted to believe that she wouldn't betray you," Harper finished for him, his voice softer now. "Let me give you some advice, Ethan. People don't change overnight. They just get better at hiding who they really are." Hours passed in the holding cell after Harper left. The other detainees barely registered to Ethan, their conversations a low hum in the background. He leaned against the cold cinderblock wall, his thoughts circling back to Alina. Was it all for fun? A thrill? Or was there something deeper he hadn't seen? The betrayal cut deeper than the infidelity itself. It wasn't just about her body, it was about trust, loyalty, and the life they had built together. Every anniversary, every inside joke, every promise, they all felt like lies now. As he stared at the flickering overhead light, Ethan thought about the note he'd found. The handwriting so familiar, so casual. Had she written it with any hesitation? Did she even care about the consequences? Or was he just a footnote in her story? He replayed the night over and over in his head. The way she looked at him in that hotel room, not with fear or remorse, but with irritation, as if he was the one ruining everything. The memory made his stomach churn. A guard finally came to let him out hours later, his voice gruff. "You're free to go. Pending charges and a court date, of course." Ethan stepped out into the crisp night air, the cold biting at his skin. For a moment he just stood there, staring up at the stars. They were the same as they'd always been, indifferent to his pain. He wanted to scream, to curse the universe for its cruel sense of humor. But he didn't. Instead, he walked to his car, his movements mechanical. As he gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts crystallized. He couldn't let this destroy him. He couldn't let Alina's betrayal define him. She had shattered his world, yes, but now it was up to him to rebuild it, stronger, harder, and better than before. For the first time since the night began, Ethan felt a sliver of resolve. Alina had taken so much from him, but she wouldn't take everything. Not his future. Not his dignity. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Ethan stood outside the hospital room, the steady beep of the machines inside muffled by the thick wooden door. He had paced the hallway for what felt like an eternity, replaying every moment from the night before in his mind. The image of Alina sprawled across that bed, surrounded by strangers, haunted him. But he needed answers, and the only person who could provide them was the woman on the other side of that door. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open. The room was dimly lit, the faint hum of medical equipment filling the silence. Alina sat propped up against a mound of pillows, her hair tousled and her complexion pale. Despite her disheveled appearance, she still managed to exude an air of defiance. Her gaze snapped to him as he entered, her lips curling into a bitter smirk. "Well, if it isn't the hero of the hour," she drawled, her voice laced with sarcasm. Ethan stopped just inside the door, his fists clenching at his sides. "Hero? Is that what you call someone who walks in on their wife in bed with a group of strangers?" Alina's expression didn't falter. If anything, she looked amused. "You stormed in like some action movie reject, Ethan. What did you think was going to happen? You could have killed someone." Ethan's chest tightened, anger bubbling just below the surface. "What did I think was going to happen? What did you think was going to happen, Alina? Did you honestly think I wouldn't find out?" Alina shrugged, her nonchalance like gasoline on the fire of Ethan's rage. "I didn't think you cared enough to notice," she said bluntly. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the person he thought he had married. 12 years, Alina. 12 years of marriage, and this is what it's come to? You cheating on me with—" He paused, his voice cracking. "With a group of men? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed her face, though it wasn't remorse. It was disdain. "What I've done," she snapped. "What I've done, Ethan, is try to find something, anything to make me feel alive again. You've been so boring. So predictable. Do you even realize how suffocating that is?" Ethan's jaw tightened, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Suffocating? You're blaming me for this? Yes, she said, her voice rising. You think you're some perfect husband, but you're not. You never listen, Ethan. You never see me. For years, I felt invisible, like I'm just part of the furniture in your perfectly ordered life. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. So your solution was this? Betrayal? Deception? You've torn our life apart, Alina. Alina leaned back against the pillows, her defiance softening into something colder. I didn't tear it apart, Ethan. It was already falling apart. You just didn't notice? Ethan stared at her, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. For years he had prided himself on being a good husband. He worked hard to provide for them, to build a stable, comfortable life. Had he missed something? Had he been so focused on their future that he'd overlooked the cracks forming in the present? But no, this wasn't his fault. He had been there. He had been loyal. Alina had made a choice, and it wasn't one he could forgive. I trusted you, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I built my life around you. And you threw it away for what? A thrill? A distraction? Alina didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her tone was ice cold. I didn't throw it away, Ethan. I outgrew it. And you? Her words were a dagger to his heart. He stared at her, struggling to find the woman he had loved in the stranger before him. You outgrew me? He repeated, his voice trembling. So what was all of this? The anniversaries, the trips, the promises? Lies. They weren't lies, she said, her voice softening for a moment. They were just moments. And moments pass. Ethan felt like the ground beneath him had crumbled. The woman he had loved, the life they had built, it was all an illusion. You're unbelievable, he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. You're sitting here blaming me, acting like you're the victim in all of this. But you're not, Alina. You're not the victim. You're the villain. Alina's eyes flashed with something, regret? Guilt? But it disappeared as quickly as it came. Believe what you want, Ethan, she said, turning away. It doesn't change anything. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving as he tried to rein in his emotions. Finally he turned and walked to the door. You're right about one thing, he said, glancing back at her. This doesn't change anything. Except me. I'm done, Alina. I'm done being your fool. He left the room without waiting for a response, the door clicking shut behind him. For the first time he felt a sense of finality. Alina's betrayal had cut him deeply, but he wouldn't let it define him. She had chosen her path, and now he would choose his. As he walked down the sterile hospital corridor, Ethan knew one thing for certain. The life he had known was over. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. The hum of the coffee shop was a low, comforting murmur as Ethan sat across from Rachel, his longtime friend and lawyer. Her auburn hair was tied in a no-nonsense bun, and her sharp green eyes scanned the documents Ethan had spread across the table. They sat in a corner booth, away from prying ears, though Ethan doubted anyone would believe the story he was unraveling. Rachel finally looked up, her expression equal parts pity and determination. Ethan, this is bad. Really bad. But you've already taken the first step by coming to me. We're going to get through this. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration radiating from every pore. I don't even know where to start, Rachel. She blindsided me. 12 years and I didn't see it coming. Rachel leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. Then let's start at the beginning. What do we know for sure? And what do we need to find out? Ethan had already begun piecing the puzzle together. After Alina's accusations at the hospital, he'd realized how little he truly knew about the woman he married. Her accusations of boredom and feeling invisible had rattled him, but they weren't excuses for the betrayal she'd orchestrated. There had to be more. I found this, Ethan said, sliding his phone across the table. On the screen was a photo from Alina's social media account, posted months ago. It was taken at a swanky downtown bar, Alina laughing with a man Ethan now recognized as Jim. She told me it was a work event. That guy? He's one of them. From the hotel. Rachel studied the photo, her brows knitting together. Social media can be a goldmine for this kind of thing. We'll need screenshots, timestamps, everything. But this? It's a start? Ethan exhaled sharply, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Rachel, I don't just want to divorce her. I need to understand. Who is this woman? Rachel nodded, her expression softening. We'll get to the bottom of it. But first, we need to secure your finances. I can't stress this enough, Ethan. If she's been lying to you about this, she might have been dishonest about other things too. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of bank statements, credit card bills, and printed screenshots from Alina's social media accounts. He scoured each detail, looking for any clue that might reveal the depth of her betrayal. Hours passed before he found something, a series of hotel charges going back nearly a year. The pattern was obvious: high-end hotels, dinner reservations, and boutique shopping sprees. It all pointed to a double life. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. The caller ID read Jim. Ethan stared at it for a moment, his chest tightening with anger, but he answered. "What do you want?" Ethan's voice was cold. "I'm not calling to fight," Jim said, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. "Look, I didn't know she was married. Not at first. I swear." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "But you knew eventually, didn't you? And you didn't care." Jim sighed. "I didn't call to argue, man. I called because you deserve to know the truth. Alina, she's not who you think she is. She's been doing this for years." Ethan's heart dropped. "What are you talking about?" "She told me about you," Jim continued. "Not directly, but enough. She said you were boring, predictable. That you wouldn't notice if she found excitement elsewhere. She gets off on it, Ethan. The thrill of it. The lies, the danger. She used me just like she's used others." Ethan's stomach churned as Jim went on to describe how Alina had woven a web of deceit, luring men in with her charm and confidence, then discarding them when the thrill wore off. "You're not the first, Ethan," Jim said finally. "And I doubt you'll be the last." The call left Ethan reeling. It wasn't just about him, it was about a pattern. Alina wasn't simply a wife who'd strayed. She was a woman who thrived on manipulation and destruction. Her charm, her sharp wit, the confidence that had once captivated him, it was all a facade, a tool she wielded to get what she wanted. The next day, Ethan confronted her past head-on. Using the contacts Jim had reluctantly provided, he reached out to others Alina had entangled in her web. What he found only confirmed Jim's account. Each man shared similar stories of deceit and heartbreak, painting a picture of Alina as a serial manipulator, someone who reveled in the chaos she created. That evening, Ethan sat alone in his living room, the evidence spread out before him like the pieces of a shattered mirror. Each piece reflected a side of Alina he hadn't seen, or had refused to see. The charming, driven woman he had fallen in love with had always been capable of this. He just hadn't wanted to believe it. Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "Ethan, I've reviewed everything you sent. This isn't just about the divorce. You've been living with a stranger. Let's make sure she doesn't take anything more from you." As he stared at the message, a new resolve settled over Ethan. Alina had taken his trust, his love, and 12 years of his life. But she wouldn't take his future. This was war, and Ethan was ready to fight. The morning sun poured through the blinds as Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open to a sea of bank statements, legal documents, and email threads. It had been weeks since the night that shattered his world, and in that time, he'd channeled every ounce of his pain into preparation. Rachel's advice rang in his head. "You need to protect yourself." The first step had been locking down the finances. Ethan meticulously froze their joint accounts, canceled shared credit cards, and redirected his paycheck into a new, private account. He wasn't about to let Alina siphon away the life they'd built together, not after what she had done. The next step had been more symbolic, clearing her presence from the house. Her clothes, her books, the decorative throw pillows she'd insisted were essential, all of it was boxed up and stacked by the curb. What remained was the house Ethan had built, stripped of the lies that had filled it. That afternoon, Ethan sat across from Rachel in her office. She slid a thick envelope toward him, the divorce papers. "Here it is," Rachel said, her voice steady but firm. "Everything's airtight. You've got the evidence, the financial security, and the upper hand. Serving these will start the clock." Ethan stared at the envelope for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on him. This wasn't just a legal document, it was the beginning of the end of a life he thought would last forever. With a deep breath, he nodded. "Let's do it." The papers were served later that day. Ethan knew Alina wouldn't take it quietly, and he was right. By 3 p.m., the sound of screeching tires tore through the quiet of the neighborhood. Moments later, the front door burst open and Alina stormed in, her face a mix of fury and disbelief. "What the hell is this, Ethan?" she demanded, waving the papers like a weapon. Ethan remained seated in the living room, calm and collected. "It's exactly what it looks like," he said evenly. "We're done, Alina." Her laugh was sharp and bitter. "You don't get to decide that. This is my house too. You can't just throw me out and serve me divorce papers like I'm some stranger." Ethan leaned back, his expression unflinching. "Actually, I can. And I already have. Alina's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think this makes you the bigger person? You think you're some saint? You've always been boring, Ethan. Predictable. No wonder I had to look elsewhere. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he refused to let her bait him. Funny how boring paid for this house, kept us comfortable, and trusted you blindly. But sure, blame me. That's what you're good at, isn't it? She scoffed, throwing the papers onto the coffee table. This is a joke. None of this will hold up in court. Ethan's lips curled into a bitter smile. Won't it? He reached behind him and grabbed a folder, tossing it onto the table beside the papers. Take a look. Alina hesitated, then snatched up the folder. As she flipped through the pages, her bravado began to falter. Screenshots of text messages, time-stamped receipts from hotel stays, and photographs from her own social media painted a damning picture of her infidelity. Each piece of evidence was meticulously organized, a narrative of her betrayal laid bare. Her face paled, but she tried to recover. You really went through all this trouble? You're pathetic, Ethan. Pathetic? He repeated, his voice rising slightly. Pathetic is lying to someone who trusted you. Pathetic is sneaking around and tearing apart a marriage for fun. Don't talk to me about pathetic, Alina. This is justice. Alina's hands trembled as she slammed the folder shut. So what? People cheat all the time. This doesn't make you a hero? Ethan leaned forward, his gaze piercing. It's not about being a hero, Alina. It's about making sure you don't walk away from this unscathed. You wanted excitement? Well, now you've got it. Court dates, lawyers, and a reputation that'll follow you everywhere. Congratulations. For the first time, Alina seemed genuinely rattled. Her confidence, her smirking superiority, all of it cracked under the weight of the truth staring back at her. You're going to regret this, she spat, her voice shaking. Ethan stood, towering over her. No, Alina. The only thing I regret is not seeing you for who you really are sooner. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, but her exit felt hollow. Ethan stood in the silence, his breathing steady as the adrenaline coursed through him. For the first time in weeks, he felt in control. The anger, the heartbreak, it was all still there, but now it had a purpose. That evening, Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The house was quiet, stripped of her chaos, and for the first time, it felt like his again. Alina might have shattered their life together, but Ethan had taken the pieces and forged a weapon. She had underestimated him, and now she was paying the price. As the night deepened, a sense of calm settled over Ethan. Revenge wasn't just about hurting Alina. It was about reclaiming his life, and he wasn't done yet. The house was eerily quiet in the weeks that followed Alina's dramatic exit, but for Ethan the silence wasn't suffocating, it was liberating. The tension that had clouded his life for months was finally lifting. It was time to rebuild, to rediscover himself in a life no longer tethered to deceit. Ethan's first stop was the local gym, a place he hadn't stepped into since his early 20s. The scent of rubber mats and faintly metallic weights filled the air as he signed up for a membership. At first, the treadmill felt like a punishment, each step forcing him to confront the anger and pain swirling inside him. But as days turned into weeks, the gym became his sanctuary. The rhythm of lifting weights and pounding the treadmill helped him focus. Each rep felt like shedding a layer of his old life, and each drop of sweat was a step toward the man he wanted to be. His reflection in the gym's mirror began to change, not just physically but emotionally. For the first time in years, he saw confidence staring back at him. One afternoon, while cleaning out the garage, Ethan stumbled upon an old sketch pad buried under a pile of tools. Flipping through the pages, he smiled at the rough sketches of landscapes and faces he'd drawn in college. Art had been his passion once, a way to process emotions he couldn't put into words. He grabbed a pencil and hesitated for a moment before sketching again. The first lines were clumsy, his hands stiff from years of neglect, but soon the movements became natural. He spent hours at the kitchen table, lost in a world of shading and lines, creating vivid images that mirrored the chaos and transformation in his life. Art became more than a hobby, it was therapy. Ethan started attending local art classes, where he met others who shared his passion. He learned new techniques, displayed his work in small community galleries, and felt a sense of accomplishment that had been missing for years. It was after a late gym session that Ethan literally ran into Sarah. She was balancing a coffee and a gym bag when he accidentally bumped into her, spilling the drink across the floor. "Great start to a conversation," she said with a laugh, brushing her hair out of her face. Her warm smile and genuine demeanor instantly set Ethan at ease. They exchanged numbers, and a week later Ethan found himself sitting across from her at a cafe, talking like old friends. Sarah was different from Alina in every way. Where Alina had been calculating and sharp, Sarah was kind and empathetic. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, filled with laughter and shared stories about their lives. Sarah didn't ask him to rush into anything, nor did she try to fix him. She simply listened, offering a safe space where Ethan could start to trust again. Over time their coffee dates turned into dinners, then weekend outings. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, it was steady, healing, and exactly what Ethan needed. With Sarah's encouragement and his growing passion for art, Ethan began to feel whole again. The anger and bitterness that once consumed him started to fade. He was no longer defined by Alina's betrayal but by his own resilience and growth. When Ethan was asked to showcase his art at a local gallery, Sarah was by his side. Watching strangers admire his work, he realized just how far he'd come. Alina might have tried to break him, but she had only succeeded in helping him find his true self. The courtroom was silent as Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, Rachel beside him, her legal pad stacked with meticulously organized notes. Across the aisle, Alina sat with her lawyer, dressed in a crisp blazer that screamed polished innocence. But Ethan knew better. Today wasn't just about the divorce, it was about truth and accountability. Rachel opened the proceedings with calm confidence, laying out the case piece by piece. She presented the financial documents, highlighting Alina's suspicious spending. She showed the judge screenshots of text messages and photos from Alina's social media accounts, proving her infidelity beyond a shadow of a doubt. Ethan watched Alina's expression shift from smug indifference to barely concealed panic. She whispered furiously to her lawyer, but there was nothing they could do to discredit the mountain of evidence. When it was Alina's turn, she leaned forward, her voice dripping with feigned vulnerability. "Your Honor, I made mistakes," she said, her eyes glistening with crocodile tears. But Ethan wasn't perfect either. He was distant, controlling. "I felt invisible in my own marriage." Ethan clenched his fists under the table, forcing himself to stay calm. Rachel had warned him this would happen. Alina would try to rewrite the narrative, casting herself as the victim. Rachel rose to her feet, her tone sharp. "Mrs. Hunter, are you suggesting that feeling invisible justifies years of infidelity? That your client's deliberate actions were the result of anything other than her own choices?" Alina opened her mouth to respond, but Rachel didn't give her the chance. "Let me remind the court," she continued, "that the evidence speaks for itself. This isn't a case of marital disagreements, it's a case of calculated betrayal." As the proceedings neared their end, Ethan pulled out his trump card, a recording of a conversation he'd had with Alina weeks earlier. In the audio, Alina admitted to her actions, even laughing about how she had manipulated Ethan. "You think I care about him?" Her voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. "He was just a stepping stone. I used him just like I've used everyone else. It's not my fault he couldn't keep up." The room fell into stunned silence. Alina's lawyer stammered, trying to object, but the damage was done. The judge leaned back, her expression grim. "I think I've heard enough," she said, bringing down the gavel. When the judge ruled in Ethan's favor, awarding him the majority of their shared assets and absolving him of any alimony payments, he felt a surge of relief. Alina's manipulations had finally caught up with her. As they exited the courtroom, Alina cornered him in the hallway. "Congratulations," she sneered, her composure crumbling. "You've won. Are you happy now?" Ethan met her gaze, his voice steady. "I didn't win, Alina. I survived. And now I'm free." He walked away, leaving her standing there, a shadow of the confident woman who once thought she could control everything. Ethan had started the day as a man fighting for closure, but he ended it as a man finally free from the weight of the past. The courtroom showdown wasn't just a victory over Alina, it was the final chapter in a story of betrayal, pain, and redemption. Now it was time to start a new story, one he would write on his own terms. Ethan had just returned from an art class when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He wiped his hands on a towel and glanced at the screen. The sender's name stopped him cold, Alina. It was the first time he'd heard from her since the courtroom showdown. The message was brief, almost hesitant. "Ethan, I need to talk to you. Please. It's important." For a long moment Ethan stared at the words. He considered ignoring it. What could she possibly have to say now? But curiosity, or perhaps a lingering need for closure, gnawed at him. Against his better judgment, he replied, "What do you want?" Her response was immediate. "Just one conversation. Face to face. Tomorrow at the cafe downtown." The next day Ethan walked into the cafe, his emotions carefully locked away. He spotted her immediately, sitting at a corner table, looking polished but subdued. There was a weariness in her posture, a far cry from the confident woman who had once dominated his life. When she saw him, she offered a tentative smile. "Thanks for coming." Ethan didn't return the gesture. Instead, he sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "Say what you need to say, Alina. I don't have all day." Her smile faltered, and she took a sip of her coffee before speaking. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since everything. Therapy mostly. And I've realized I owe you an apology." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "An apology? That's it?" Alina hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she set the cup down. "I know I hurt you. More than I can ever make up for. I let my insecurities, my selfishness ruin everything. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you I'm sorry." Ethan studied her, searching for signs of manipulation, but she seemed genuinely remorseful. Still, it wasn't enough to erase the pain she had caused. "You're right," he said evenly. "I don't forgive you. What you did wasn't a mistake, it was a choice." Over and over again. She nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I know. And I'll carry that guilt with me for the rest of my life." For the first time, Ethan felt something unexpected: pity. Not for the woman she had been to him, but for the person she had become. She wasn't the cunning, confident Alina he had once known. She was a fractured version of herself, broken by her own decisions. "You didn't just hurt me, Alina," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "You destroyed trust. You turned our life into a lie. And while I've spent the last year rebuilding, I hope you've spent it figuring out why you chose to do what you did." She wiped her eyes, nodding. "I have. I'm trying, Ethan. I really am." "Good," he replied, rising from his seat. "I hope you find peace, Alina. But I've already found mine. And I'm not looking back." As he walked out of the cafe, Ethan felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted. The chapter with Alina was officially closed, and he was free to move forward without her shadow looming over him. 6 months later, Ethan stood in the center of a prestigious New York art gallery, surrounded by a sea of faces. The walls were lined with bold, emotional pieces that reflected his journey, the pain, the healing, and the transformation. One painting in particular drew the most attention, a swirling mix of blues and golds titled Rebirth. It was the first time Ethan's work had been featured in such a prominent exhibit, and he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Not long ago, he'd been a man lost in the wreckage of a failed marriage. Now he was an artist, a storyteller in color and texture, sharing his truth with the world. Beside him stood Sarah, her hand warm in his. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, her eyes sparkling as she beamed at him. "Look at all these people, Ethan. They're here because of you. Because of your art." Ethan turned to her, his smile genuine. "No, they're here because of what the art represents. Pain doesn't have to define you, it can transform you." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You've come so far. I'm so proud of you." As the evening unfolded, Ethan mingled with guests, answering questions about his process and inspirations. Each conversation reaffirmed that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Later that night, Ethan and Sarah walked through the bustling streets of New York, the city alive with energy. The cool air nipped at their faces, but neither seemed to notice. "I can't believe how far I've come," Ethan admitted as they strolled. "A year ago I couldn't have imagined this, any of it." Sarah smiled, wrapping her arm around his. "Life has a way of surprising you. Sometimes the worst things can lead to the best things." Ethan stopped and turned to her, his expression soft. "Sarah, I couldn't have done this without you. You reminded me that there's still good in the world, still people worth trusting. Thank you for being by my side." She blushed, her laughter light. "You give me too much credit. You were always the strong Ethan. You just needed to remember it." That night, as they sat on the balcony of their hotel, overlooking the city lights, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The betrayal that once consumed him felt like a distant memory. Alina was a chapter of his life, but she no longer defined him. He thought about the man he had become, confident, resilient, and at peace. His journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. Ethan raised his glass of wine, toasting the night sky. "To freedom," he said quietly. Sarah raised her glass in return. "To you, Ethan. And everything that's still ahead." In that moment, Ethan knew the future was his to shape. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. And for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. So that's Ethan's story, a journey of heartbreak, resilience, and rediscovery. Life threw him into a storm, but he came out stronger, wiser, and finally free. Ethan's story isn't just about betrayal, it's about transformation. It's proof that no matter how much someone tries to break you, you can always rebuild. Now, I want to hear from all of you. What would you have done if you were in Ethan's shoes? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to rebuild your life? Let's get the conversation going in the comments below. Your stories inspire me just as much as Ethan's inspires all of us. And if you love this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Unheard Stories for more tales of shocking betrayals, unexpected twists, and satisfying endings. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, life may knock you down, but the power to get back up is always in your hands. Until next time, take care and keep writing your own story.